Hello, and welcome to the NCSS C3 Collaborative Literacy Professional Development webinar, Meeting the Common Core for ELA Part 1, How Does the C3 Framework Align to the Common Core? This webinar, along with others in our series, are part of the College, Career, and Civic Life Framework for Social Studies State Standards Literacy Collaborative, C3LC, which NCSS is implementing in collaboration with the National Center for Literacy and Education and which is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. My name is Anna Post, and I'm the Director of External Relations and Council Communications at NCSS, as well as this grant's project coordinator. The goal of this initiative is to create and operationalize a plan designed specifically for social studies teachers to implement the Common Core state standards for English language arts by utilizing the C3 framework. This webinar is produced in conjunction with an in-depth investigation that can be accessed by C3LC project teacher groups at the Literacy and Learning Exchange site. Non-project participants will also be able to access the project activities and learning modules at the Exchange site or at the NCSS C3LC webpage. Links to these web locations will be provided at the end of the webinar. Before I introduce our presenter today, I just wanted to remind you not to hesitate in sharing your comments or questions via the chat box on your lower right-hand corner. With that, let me introduce today's presenter, Dr. Tina Hefner. Dr. Hefner is professor at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. She is the lead social studies methods instructor and directs the Master of Education in Secondary Education and the Minor in Secondary Education. She has published 7 books, including Targeted Vocabulary Instruction in Secondary Social Studies, Strategic Reading in World and U.S. History, and Seeds of Inquiry, using short texts to support students' understanding of U.S. history. Dr. Hefner, thank you for being with us today and doing this presentation.
Thank you, Anna. It is a pleasure to be here with you and with everyone else. And I say hello especially to the audience, to Dixie Massey, who's actually the co-author on several of those books that Anna mentioned at the very beginning. The Common Core state standards outline grade-by-grade goals for K-12 students, goals that are attuned to the advanced literacy skills needed for college, career, and citizenship. Similarly, the C3 framework calls for students to become prepared for challenges of college, career, while also preparing for civic life. With an emphasis on citizenship, the C3 framework sets forth as its goal to prepare knowledgeable, thinking, and well-informed and articulate and active citizens. And that's language that's probably very familiar to you because most of you, at least I imagine, have had some exposure to the Common Core state standards. Many of you, I see your names, and I know you've been a part of our C3LC initiative, and so you're becoming much more familiar with the C3. Our goal for this particular session is to look at the alignment between the two sets of standards and to identify how we can serve the interest of both in the work that we do within our social studies, English language arts classrooms. At the heart of the work that we do within our C3 framework is inquiry. The inquiry arc guides the focus of the C3 framework. By focusing on inquiry, the framework emphasizes the disciplinary concepts and practices that support students as they develop the capacity to know, to analyze, to explain, and to argue about interdisciplinary challenges in our social world. Agreeing that inquiry and the pursuit of knowledge through questioning is a central focus of the 4 core social studies disciplines, civics, economics, geography, and history, the C3 framework is organized around an inquiry arc composed of 4 dimensions. And again, this is a review of what you know about the C3 framework. Let's review briefly the 4 dimensions. The first dimension focuses on developing compelling questions and supporting questions that can frame and advance inquiry. Dimension 2 emphasizes applying concepts and tools from our content domains to help address inquiry and answer questions. The third dimension centers on students evaluating sources and using evidence when addressing questions. Dimension 4 presents the learning opportunities for students to communicate conclusions and take informed action on issues and problems identified through the inquiry process. The final dimension can and often does lead to more inquiry. The C3 framework provides the learning experiences and tools necessary for informed, skilled, and engaged participation in civic life. So under that context of what the C3 framework intends to achieve, let's think briefly about how the C3 aligns with the Common Core standards, specifically for English and language arts. So I have a question that I want to ask you before we begin our initial investigation into how the two standards align. And that is the question of why should teachers integrate ELA, integrate the Common Core standards within their social studies instruction. So why should we integrate the C3 framework with the Common Core standards? And you might not know an answer, but I'd like to poll you just to see what your initial thinking is. Okay, so to communicate understanding. The skill of communication is an important aspect of the Common Core standards. And I'm assuming by it adds further depth to social studies topics. The skills the literacy skills that come out of the Common Core add further depth to the social studies topics, yes. Social studies content is excellent fodder for reading, writing, thinking, and listening, absolutely, yes. Both areas are correlated skills. I like the language of correlated, and that's something I think that we'll reiterate again. To ensure that students are mastering key writing, research, communication. This is the first time I've seen the word research, which is another important aspect of a skill that the Common Core expects us to teach. And it's also a skill that aligns very closely with the C3 framework. We know better than anyone how to teach our kids reading and writing in the social studies, and very important, reading and writing in the social studies. And that is an attribute of our C3 framework as the domain-specific learning. So we'll, again, look very closely at that. And yes, much of what we've been doing is good practice. There also have been, there's been evidence of a lack of deep, rich, text-based reading, writing, and discussion or thinking associated with that advanced level of text-oriented, evidence-based thinking. In secondary education, English teachers should not do it all for teaching, reading, and writing. Excellent point. Excellent point. The teaching of reading, writing, and speaking, and listening, and language are not just expectations for English teachers. Great thinking. All right, so this is my compelling question. When I wanted to understand the correlation between the two sets of standards, I thought that it was more than just how they align. I wanted to ask a very purposeful question of why we should continue to think about the integration of the two sets of standards. And so what I'm going to present to you is a case for why we need to integrate and also how the two standards align. We have, of course, the C3 framework being built upon the existing Common Core state standards. There is very purposeful integration, and we're going to look at that closely tonight too. But there's also the piece of why we need to consider the value of the literacy skills and how it supports the instruction we want to achieve within the C3 framework. Our specific objectives for this evening, and also for those teams that are engaging in the C3LC investigation, there are three objectives that I hope to achieve, and that is to evaluate various sources, to develop claims, and cite convincing evidence to explain the rationale for integrating social studies and ELA instruction. And second is to align the concepts and skills presented within the Common Core state standards and the C3 framework, to evaluate their commonalities and their differences as well. And the third objective is to describe the instructional shifts resulting from the C3 framework, and also instructional shifts that align with those expected within the Common Core. The extension of how this applies to lesson design and implementation is the extension that the investigation will take you on. We won't go into a lot of depth with that third objective for this evening. So David Coleman is one of the authors of the Common Core State Standards, and he makes a case for why it's very important that we need to have literacy in other disciplines. The standards set requirements not only for English language arts, but also for literacy in history and the social studies. Just as students must learn to read, write, speak, listen, and use language effectively in a variety of content areas, so too must the standards specify the literacy skills and understandings required for college and career readiness in multiple disciplines. So let's hear what David Coleman has to say about our role as social studies teachers and educators and English language arts educators. What's our dual role and responsibility?
One of the most exciting things about the Common Core standards in English language arts, as well as literacy in history and social studies, science and technical subjects, is precisely that last phrase. They are not just standards for English language arts. They are indeed standards for the wide range of literacies, including reading and writing about, history and social science text, scientific and technical text, the wide range of texts that offer students full access to success in college and career. And what's exciting about those changes is the history and science communities, those practitioners as well as higher education in those fields, were wonderfully involved in the development of those specific standards for reading and writing well in history and social studies as well as science and technical subjects. They are not bland literacy or reading standards. What they are instead is carefully thought out standards for what it means to analyze primary and secondary sources to build knowledge in history and social studies, and what it is to read reference materials and experimental results, to explore scientific debate. These standards were built with scientists, with historians, with people active in social studies, to insist on the literacy skills that are at the heart of mastering more complex text in those disciplines, in gaining access to conversation in those disciplines, and building knowledge, most importantly, in those disciplines, knowledge that will serve students in all their work that comes to follow. And that means a good deal of change, because today, students are not ready to read sufficiently difficult texts in the disciplines. There was a worrisome study by ACT that showed only a quarter of students who take their exam to show their readiness for college can read a sufficiently difficult scientific text. I want to say a little more about what we mean by building knowledge through reading and writing. It doesn't mean simply that students can refer to a text they've read in history or social studies and mention that in Federalist Paper 51, someone named Madison had some ideas about faction. To be able to read and gain knowledge to analyze that document would be, as the standards require, to examine precisely what Madison said or didn't say about faction, and from reading that document carefully, having a rich and deep understanding about precisely what Madison thought about faction. It's about the close study of primary documents to understand from whence they come and what they might mean and not mean. It's integrating and synthesizing knowledge. So it's not just referring to what one's read, but having a command of what one's read, and presenting that both in speaking and listening, in science and history, as well as in writing. In science, of course, you're blending constantly what you learn from reading with what you learn from direct experimentation and other methods. And sometimes people say, oh, I don't teach science through reading, I teach it through hands-on science. But as all of us know, the fact is that most scientists spend up to 50% of their time reading. A great deal of knowledge is gained through reading and writing, and it's crucial that students gain this training within their scientific and history and social studies classrooms so that they're ready for the demands of career and college. Studies.
Right, so as David Coleman articulates, standards are needed not just for ELA standards, but these standards are also important for providing a wide range of literacies. Literacies that are discipline specific, literacies that students only can engage in social studies, complex texts that offer full access to preparation as citizens, informational texts in particular that students encounter within social studies. He also articulates the importance of analyzing primary and secondary sources, again, a discipline-specific skill set. A discipline-specific skill set that's unique to history, or that's unique to economics, or geography, or political science. Mastering these complex text, discipline-specific text, and building that knowledge through reading and writing are important disciplinary skills that can only be taught by social studies educators. There's also another piece that the Common Core emphasizes, and that's not just the text that students read, but it's also what students can do with that knowledge, the knowledge that they gain from those texts, how effectively students can communicate discipline-specific knowledge. So let's look at some of the foundational literacy skills that come out of the Common Core that inform the social studies. Common foundational skills that not necessarily inform, but are already attributes, as I think one of the posts indicated. It's something that we already do within social studies, like citing textual evidence. That's something that we do and we teach within social studies. Understanding discipline-specific vocabulary. I mentioned research, I think you also articulated. Engaging in democratic discourse is actually language that's explicit within the Common Core standards and something that is an important aspect of the C3 framework. Distinguishing, competing, or alternating claims, looking at various perspectives, diverse and counter perspectives. An important piece here, though, is literacy. Literacy is the key word because the teaching of social studies should have reading and writing at its core. Teaching students to be informed readers, to be informed writers, to be informed thinkers, to be articulate in their ability to communicate the knowledge that they gain from these texts is an important and necessary skill for promoting civic engagement and civic preparation and informed action. So if we look again at some of the language that's within the C3 framework, literacy standards for grades 6 and above are predicated on teachers of ELA and history and the social studies, the sciences and technical subjects, using content area expertise. That comes language explicit from the Common Core, and if we look at C3 on page 6, we have a similar emphasis again on disciplinary practices and literacies needed for college-level work in social studies, academic courses, for critical thinking, problem-solving, collaborative skills, and workplace, and also civic life. Literacy skills and disciplinary specific practices are essential for beyond the Common Core. They're also very specific to our discipline. So how is it viewed in a sense of what is the partnership that we have between the C3 and the Common Core? Let's hear from a brief statement from Michelle Herzog as she provides an explanation of the bridge between the Common Core. And she identifies the C3 as this bridge, the bridge for creating this shared interest in promoting Common Core.
On in this project, there were a number of social studies experts from the various state departments of ed who were involved in the work. They emphasized the need for the document to be aligned to the Common Core state standards that many of their states were in the process of adopting. We know there's about 45 states that have adopted it now. Not to supplant or default to, but we know that social studies education provides a wonderful context for promoting reading, writing, speaking, listening, and language skills. So it seemed only natural for the writers to intentionally demonstrate how the C3 framework is useful as a bridge.
So Michelle, again, uses the language of a bridge, but she also says that social studies provides a wonderful context for reading, writing, speaking, listening, and language development. All aspects of the Common Core that the C3 does. And there's this purposeful alignment, as I indicated before, in the development of the C3 framework, so that the Common Core informs much of the thinking and the ideas and the skill development necessary for building upon within the C3 framework. There's also the articulation of a shared responsibility for disciplinary literacy. And this is explicitly articulated within the C3 framework on page 7, reflecting the shared responsibility for literacy learning put forth in the Common Core state standards. Just as David Coleman indicated that the Common Core state standards are not something that can be achieved alone by English language arts teachers, it's something that has to require all disciplines. The social studies and the National Council for the Social Studies and the C3 framework also embrace this idea that we have a common shared responsibility for literacy instruction. The C3 framework fully incorporates and extends the expectations for grades K-5 English language arts standards and the grades 6 through 12 standards for literacy and history and the social sciences and social studies. The C3 framework also recognizes the importance of literacy within Common Core state standards for mathematics. There is this mutual and shared responsibility for discipline-specific literacy. So let me ask you, pause just a moment here and have you think about what you are doing in social studies or English language arts that supports the shared literacy aims of the Common Core. How do you see the work that you're doing supporting both the C3 interest and emphasis on the shared responsibility for literacy and the Common Core's expectation as well? Have students develop historical arguments? Yes. The language, the shared language of arguments. Analyzing primary sources? Yes. Evaluating sources to support a claim? Again, common and shared language I see with the C3 and the Common Core. Using primary sources, visual text. Visual and text. Visualization, visual text are also important language coming from the Common Core. That's supported within the C3 framework. Utilizing strands in Socratic seminar, the ability to articulate, to speak, to listen, to communicate evidence-based thinking. Yes. Have students read secondary sources by historians as models for effective writing. Asking, how do you know? And what does the text say? Yes, always using evidence-supported, evidence-informed thinking. Writing arguments, reading informational text, citing evidence, wonderful. I'm glad to see the exceptional work. Much of what you're already doing aligns with C3 and Common Core. Students selecting a societal issue, research the background and ways to address and take action through communication. Language clearly articulated within the C3 framework. Close reading. That one hasn't appeared yet. Yes, close reading. Reading Anchor Standard 1. Interacting with short sections of writing. All right, so let's look a little bit more closely at the C3 framework. And this language of shared responsibility. Now, David Coleman says, there's no way we'll break the barrier for 8th grade reading scores in this country that have been flat for decades unless science and history teachers and social studies teachers are full partners in demanding that students read and write to gain knowledge in their discipline. Likewise, the C3 framework contends that Now more than ever, students need the intellectual power to recognize societal problems, language that I think you articulated in our brief poll. Ask good questions and develop robust investigations into them. Consider possible solution and consequences. Separate evidence based on claims from opinions, and communicate and act upon learning. One of the ways in which we do this is engaging in research. And you can see that from Common Core Anchor Standard 9, writing through sustained research projects to answer a question. Again, some shared language that the two have in common, both achieving the same goals. John Lee actually, I think, articulates this quite clearly. He says that the Common Core state standards, they got it right. So let's hear what he has to say.
The publication of the Common Core was really a watershed moment for us in social studies, given that it came on the heels of 10 years of No Child Left Behind, which resulted in significant marginalization in social studies, particularly in the loss of instructional time for elementary grades. The Common Core was a new challenge for social studies. By incorporating social studies as a part of the shared literacy responsibility in grades K-5 and actually listing standards in grades K-6 for history social studies, as Kathy said, some people wondered out loud whether social studies was just being folded into English language arts. Well, a funny thing happened on the road to social studies' demise. Turns out the ELA Common Core got it right. The document sets forth a clear and rigorous set of standards for literacy in all the grades and in all the areas, content areas, particularly in social studies for us. And they function as a foundation for us to do the more ambitious work that we want to do in social studies, namely to prepare young people for civic life. So what does the Common Core expect of social studies, and how are we to build on that foundation in the C3 framework? First, and probably most importantly, the Common Core establishes a set of basic disciplinary skills that include the ability to cite textual evidence, the capacity to understand disciplinary vocabulary, the ability to distinguish among fact, opinion, and reasoned judgment, being able to distinguish competing or alternative claims, and the capacity to narrate historical events. In addition, the Common Core emphasizes research and Anchor Standard Writing Standard 7 and Communication and Speaking and Listening Standard 6. Common Core goes so far as to even emphasize democratic discourse, something, of course, we're pretty good at in social studies. In Speaking and Listening Standard 1B for grades 11-12, it even says that students will work with their peers to promote civil, democratic discussions and decision-making.
John indicated that, we wondered, many of the researchers wondered out loud about, our fear that social studies was being usurped by ELA and not having its own identity. But the Common Core, at least from my professional perspective, created an opportunity for social studies to embrace its prominence and its importance as a shared partner in developing literacy skills. So the idea of social studies being marginalized, yes, I think there's still evidence of some of that, but I think we have the possibility to really move social studies to the forefront as a necessary subject area for providing those opportunities to engage students with rigorous and informational texts that require disciplinary specific skills that are needed for civic life. Aspects that the Common Core even articulates and recognizes by including social studies, history, and the social studies and social sciences, because of the value that the discipline has. The expectation is that students by elementary grades, that they would read about half. It's about a 50-50 reading with fictional and informational texts. And by high school, we're talking about 3/4 of the reading being in informational texts. So the relevance and the importance, again, of the text and the opportunities that social studies can bring. John emphasizes the importance of foundational literacy skills for the social studies. And remember that the Common Core provides that foundational context, not necessarily the discipline-specific skills. And that's one point that even the Common Core language defers to the disciplines. So when we look at some of the alignment that we see within the Common Core and C3, and this is within the C3 framework standards document, there are traces and evidence of all 36 Common Core anchor standards. I highlighted here the reading standards for you from Table 4. Now, anchor reading standards are closely aligned specifically with Dimension 3, gathering evidence and evaluating sources, developing claims, and using evidence. Reading is critical to building knowledge and history in the social studies. It is critical for developing the skills that students need to be college and career ready and ready for civic life. Students have to have a wide exposure to complex text in social studies, informational text that help them begin to develop evidence-based arguments, to synthesize complex information, develop detailed descriptions of events and concepts. Students have to be able to analyze, evaluate, and differentiate primary and secondary sources, as you've already indicated. Now, if you notice here, there are anchor standards that are identified within Dimension 1. We see the reading anchor standards, all of them present within Dimension 2, the same for Dimension 3, and again, coming back to the importance of reading standard, anchored standard 1, which is close reading. And if we go again to look specifically at what is the language within the Common Core of the anchor standards or the umbrella standards for reading, informational text in particular provide the exposure to different types of genres, argument, functional text, essays, speeches, opinion pieces, literature, art and literature, especially thinking about some of the visual literacy skills that we want our students to begin to develop, biographies, memoirs, journalism, historic and technical sources for a broad range of audiences. These anchor standards do provide, again, a need to have this correlation, this partnership with reading those complex texts that only, again, are found within the social studies. When we look at the connection between the writing standards, and here identified within each of the 4 dimensions, the writing standards. Not all writing standards are applicable within a single dimension, but across all dimensions we do see evidence of this. Now, the ability to read and write within disciplines is connected to the ability to read well within disciplines is connected to the ability to read and write well. The type of writing that we ask students to do in our social studies classes is very important. This is beyond just narratives of experiences or narratives of opinions. I mean, we have to push our students beyond that to utilize evidence-informed thinking in their writing, and also to improve their communicative skills and their ability to articulate very clearly an argument that a text is making, and their understanding and their interpretation as they begin to develop claims and use evidence. And here are some, again, of the anchor standards for writing. There are 4 basic goals that the Common Core and the C3 are achieving in correlation, and that is the ability to write arguments, to write informative and explanatory text, to draw evidence from informational text, to access the credibility and the accuracy of various sources. We're going to look at the 4 types of writing.
The Common Core state standards ask students to master 3 basic types of writing: writing arguments, writing to inform and explain, and writing narratives. Narrative writing is given early prominence, as it should in elementary school, but it gives way to the other types of writing, what we might call analytical writing, writing to inform and explain, and writing arguments, as students move up the grade. So that by high school, 80% of what students will be writing to inform or explain or writing arguments, with 20% dedicated to narratives.
And what this does is enables a much fuller range of student writing that's much more closely connected to the demands of college and career. In those environments, what's crucial is that you can argue using evidence, and you can inform and take complex information and render it clear. These core standards, for the first time, build a K through 12 progression in which students gradually learn to master the use of evidence in their writing, whether it's to support an argument or to support the presentation of clear information. And of course, evidence has a marvelous role in narrative as well, in the details of a story and the evidence of a situation. A further emphasis of these standards is on short, focused research projects. Not just a one-time research project once a year or even once every couple of years, but several short research projects where students gradually comprehend an area more and more deeply, or several areas, and gain knowledge about them through doing research on them. And research is at the core of these standards, and that kind of short, focused research is essential to college and career readiness, just as is more extended research. And as you can see, the view of writing in the core standards brings them very close to reading, because writing is the outgrowth of excellent reading, gathering evidence from the text, fully understanding it, gathering evidence and evaluating different sources becomes the basis for excellent writing that makes clear arguments based on evidence and presents information clearly. What's also important is that these core standards celebrate narrative writing, developing it excellently throughout K through 12, including the core concepts of creativity and precision. But we require that students not only show their creativity and precision in narrative writing of their experience and opinions, but equally in their command of argument and their ability to convey complex information. And whether you talk to any author, whether a writer of literature, a writer of polemics, or a writer of clear, informative pieces, that precision and command of evidence is at the heart of their work and craft, and it also is at the heart of college and career readiness, and at the heart of these standards.
The Common Core State Standards ask students to learn many ways to represent data and information in their English Language Arts class, in their History and Social Studies class, and in their Science class. So you can imagine that their writing will look very different in Science and in Social Studies, and perhaps writing a literary analysis in English Language Arts class. Still coherent, still working on grammar and conventions, but the format and the organization may be different.
Of Dimension 4, communicating conclusions and taking informed actions. Developing explanations and making and supporting arguments can take the form of individual essays, group projects, or other classroom-based written assessments, both formal and informal. And even as articulated within our video is that writing will look differently. It will look differently within the various disciplines and the content domains, even within the C3 framework. I wanted to emphasize some of the shared language that exists between the two sets of standards, that of arguments, explanations, sources, evidence, claims, counterclaims, visualize, credibility. The Common Core and the C3 expect students to construct explanations, to summarize arguments, to formulate arguments, to summarize arguments from text, to present adaptations of those arguments. The core of these shared standards is evidence, that students can master text-based evidence when reading, writing, and speaking. Helping students to develop a capacity for gathering and evaluating sources and then using that evidence in disciplinary ways is the central feature and the central focus of the inquiry arc within the C3 framework. I also wanted to identify some of the correlations between the Common Core speaking and listening anchor standards and that of the C3 framework. For speaking and listening, we expect participating in a wide range of diverse conversations and collaborations. We talk about culturally responsive and culturally inclusive teaching and learning curriculum within the field of social studies. I mean, here is the engagement in those diverse conversations and examination of various perspectives and points of view in an articulate, well-informed, data-based, text-driven, evidenced conversation. The ability for students to express express ideas clearly and persuasively, utilizing their data and their evidence in meaningful ways and in articulate ways, and the ability to adapt their language and their speech in various contexts so that they can present formally what they know and what they understand and what they're learning from their text, but they're also able to engage in informal conversations. There's also within the importance of civic voice within the C3 framework, the importance of civic voice and engagement. And this is something that I think that truly sets apart the C3 framework from that of the Common Core, and that it promotes active and responsible citizens. And the ability to do this, to take informed action, requires those literacy skills, those foundational literacy skills that we mentioned before within the Common Core, but also moving beyond that. So let's look at some specific areas in which we see a little bit of difference between the two standards. No, and I did want to point that we do see one overlap within the Common Core language standards, and that is as Anchor Standard L6. We see the utilization of conventions of standard English and the student's ability to articulate what they know, and also vocabulary acquisition. And there's an emphasis within Common Core of the importance of academic language, and that academic language is something that's unique to each of the disciplines within social studies. Within the development of the C3 framework, there was a three-part strategy that was used for shared literacy instruction. Embracing the shared responsibility for literacy that we examined a little bit earlier, the integration of the Common Core reading, writing, speaking, listening, and language standards were purposely placed within the C3 framework. And we can see some evidence of this in the graphical and narrative explanations, the shared language that I pointed out a little bit already, and the foundational and vital support of connections between the anchor standards and the skill sets, the literacy skill sets that students need to be able to demonstrate their discipline-specific language and understanding within social studies. So John does a great job. John Lee from NC State University, I think, does a wonderful job of explaining some of these connections in the development of the C3 framework. And so we're going to hear from him once again for a short segment.
The publication of the Common Core was really a watershed moment for us in social studies, given that it came on the heels of 10 years of No Child Left Behind, which resulted in significant marginalization in social studies, particularly in the loss of instructional time for elementary grades. The Common Core was a new challenge for social studies. By incorporating social studies as a part of the shared literacy responsibility in grades K5 and actually listing standards in grades K6 for history social studies, as Kathy said, some people wondered out loud whether social studies was just being folded into English language arts. Well, a funny thing happened on the road to social studies' demise. Turns out the ELA Common Core got it right. The document sets forth a clear and rigorous set of standards for literacy in all the grades and in all the areas, content areas, particularly in social studies for us. And they function as a foundation for us to do the more ambitious work that we want to do in social studies, namely to prepare young people for civic life. So what does the Common Core expect of social studies, and how are we to build on that foundation in the C3 framework? First, and probably most importantly, the Common Core establishes a set of basic disciplinary skills that include the ability to cite textual evidence, the capacity to understand disciplinary vocabulary, the ability to distinguish among fact, opinion, and reasoned judgment, being able to distinguish competing or alternative claims, and the capacity to narrate historical events. In addition, the Common Core emphasizes research and Anchor Standard Writing Standard 7 and Communication and Speaking and Listening Standard 6. The Common Core goes so far as to even emphasize democratic discourse, something, of course, we're pretty good at in social studies. In Speaking and Listening Standard 1B for grades 11, 12, it even says that students will work with their peers to promote civil democratic discussions and decision-making. So what we did when we developed the C3 framework was use a three-part strategy to make connections between the ELA Common Core and the C3 framework. We took care to make the connections to all 36 anchor standards in the Common Core and did that in three ways. First, the C3 framework has been constructed in such a way as to incorporate in its entirety the ELA Common Core. So as you examine and implement the C3 in the various districts and systems in California, you'll see traces of all 36 Common Core anchor standards. And you'll see that these standards are not only present, but they're emphasized in unique ways. But again, we see all 36 of these standards as being foundational to social studies. Second, we think that some of the anchor standards are particularly supportive of the inquiry aims of the C3 framework. Specifically, all of the reading anchor standards, actually, 1 through 10, writing standard 1 and standards 7 and 9, as well as speaking and listening standards 1 through 6 and language standards 6. The third thing that you're going to see in the C3 framework is that we have emphasized a small number of Common Core anchor standards that we see as absolutely vital to inquiry in social studies, specifically reading standard 1, which is about citing evidence, writing standard 7, which is about research, and speaking and listening standard 1, which is about participating in conversations with diverse partners. So the C3 framework connects to the ELA Common Core in addition by using shared language. We use terms such as argumentation, evidence, sources, discourse, and we're doing this to replicate and complement what the Common Core has done. You're also going to find numerous graphical and narrative explanations for how the connections work out across the disciplines. Given the nice foundation that the Common Core provides us for literacy learning, the C3 framework aims to expand on the notion of literacy by setting forth two kinds of literacies. First, inquiry literacies. We have these specific inquiry literacies that play out in dimensions 1, 3, and 4. Things such as questioning, as SG talked about, gathering information, using evidence, communicating conclusions, and taking informed action. But in addition, we focus on specific disciplinary literacies. These include, in history, using deliberative processes, in civics, using deliberative processes, participating in school settings and following rules. In economics, making economic decisions, using economic data and identifying prices in a market. In geography, constructing maps, using geographic data and classifying historical sources. And in history, classifying historical sources, determining the purposes of an historical source, and analyzing cause and effect. We think that the most effective and meaningful way for social studies educators to implement the ELA Common Core is through the C3 framework. As we like to say, it's literacy through the social studies. So I hope this explanation of the connections between the ELA Common Core and the C3 framework has been useful, and I look forward to answering your questions.
So as Dr. Lee indicated, there are traces of all 36 anchor standards, and the C3 framework identifies the intensity of curricular alignment for Common Core standards. That intensity is defined in various levels, and John indicated these as vital, supportive, and foundational. And the three vital standards, I want to reiterate those again for you. The first is reading closely to determine what a text says explicitly and to make logical inferences from it. To cite textual evidence when writing or speaking to support conclusions drawn from the text. Language that is very clearly evident within the C3 framework. A second one, conduct short as well as sustained research projects based on focused questions demonstrating understanding of the subject under investigation. And the third vital standard from the Common Core is to prepare for and participate effectively in a range of conversations and collaborations with diverse partners, building on others' ideas and expressing their own clearly and persuasively. And again, the frequency with which we see much of the shared language is based on, again, this leveled approach of how the standards, the Common Core standards, were integrated in the writing of the C3 framework, where it's vital to supportive and foundational. And foundational is the shared points of literacy skill development across all disciplines. supportive, meaning more specific emphasis within the C3 framework, and vital, again, those three that I just identified as integral to the development of C3. So some of the shared language, just to reiterate a few points that John indicated, the C3 purposefully included shared language to make sure that there was a clear and concise alignment between the two sets of standards. Examples we see of shared language are argument, credibility, explanation, sources, evidence, claims, counterclaims, gather, visualize, questioning, point of view, analysis. And there are others, but those emphasize just a few. Within the C3 framework, within the document, the standards alignment, there are various tables interspersed throughout the text that identify exactly where this shared language is present, which dimension it aligns with, and the clear correlation of what standards are expected to be addressed within the teaching of these various dimensions. When we look at a shared responsibility and literacy, I see this the foundation of Common Core basic literacy skills. And then we have foundational literacies that are relevant to skill development, and then we have the C3 literacies. And John defined those C3 literacies within two areas, and that is inquiry literacies and disciplinary literacies. Inquiry literacies include things such as questioning, developing claims with evidence, communicating conclusions. Disciplinary literacies are those that emerge specifically from the four content domains of civics, economics, geography, and history. These, again, are areas in which the C3 framework not only aligns but moves beyond the expectations for literacies within the Common Core. To emphasize again some of those attributes of what we mean by inquiry literacies: questioning, gathering information, using evidence, developing claims with evidence, communicating conclusions, and again, taking informed action. Social studies has long emphasized literacy, and social studies teachers recognize their shared responsibility for literacy. So there is this extension of what literacies the Common Core expects that we can also include. So again, you can see the clear alignment of the inquiry literacies within the document. And here is yet another example of one of those tables that I indicated before that provides the alignment. Within the disciplinary specific literacies, these are literacies that are unique to each of the content domains, such as the deliberative process within civics, or using geographical data within geography, identifying prices within a market in economics, or analyzing cause-effect within history, or classifying sources within history. And again, another example of the alignment of the inquiry arc and the four dimensions with the Common Core as the basis for developing and building these inquiry and disciplinary literacies that are unique to social studies. The core of the Common Core standards, as I indicated before, is evidence. The same can be said within the C3 framework. It is important for students to master text-based evidence when they're reading, writing, and speaking. And these skill sets are necessary for promoting inquiry. Evidence-based claims and decision-making are characterized by rigor and relevance, and together these two sets of standards explicitly and comprehensively build inquiry into their core. So to highlight a few shifts that we can see that align with what we're trying to achieve within the C3 framework from the Common Core history and social science standards is the necessity for regular practice with complex text. Difficult text that include exposure to academic language necessary for the demands of college, career, and civic life, with a focus on academic language and academic vocabulary unique to the content area domains within the C3. Second is reading, writing, talking, creating are all grounded in evidence from text, visual sources as well as static sources or digital sources. And third is to build knowledge through content-rich, informational, nonfiction texts that are unique to the 4 domains within the social studies and the other disciplines within the social sciences. There are 5 primary instructional shifts from the C3 framework. The 4th is the only one that I want to highlight specific to this webinar, and that is to promote literacy practices and outcomes. One of the points that Dr. Kathy Swan indicates within this brief video snip that we're going to watch as a closing remarks is the importance and the necessity for us to articulate as social studies educators the role that we have within disciplinary literacy skill development for all students.
The 4th instructional shift is around disciplinary literacy. The Common Core ushered in an unequivocal era in which we need to take seriously our literacy practices and become explicit about those in our classroom and in our instruction. We know that we teach students to read, to write, to speak, and to learn language that is important to our disciplines. Now we need to express the ways in which we do that and articulate that clearly, not only to our students, but to our literacy colleagues as well.
This also emphasizes that shared responsibility that we have. We are an important discipline. Social studies is necessary to build much of the literacy skills that the Common Core expects. Even the Common Core identifies some instructional shifts, and these instructional shifts also support the instructional shifts of the C3 framework. Text-based answers, writing from sources, academic vocabulary, the staircase of complexity of text, knowledge within the disciplines, balancing both informational and literary text. So I'm going to offer 3 big takeaways in closing tonight, and that is social studies education and instruction should have direct and explicit connections to Common Core state standards, and those reside very clearly and are clearly articulated within the C3 framework. Each of the 4 dimensions, the content domains of civics, economics, are also important for us to engage in discipline-specific ways of linking our correlated standards with the Common Core literacies. And there are 3 vital ELA standards from the Common Core, particularly reading for information, 1, writing 7, speaking and listening. These are consistently embedded within the C3 framework. Now, in closing, while there is a clear and purposeful alignment of the C3 framework with literacy aims of the Common Core, the C3 uses these as foundational literacies and expands upon these skills to develop disciplinary literacies specific to the content domains of social studies. Together, the C3 and the Common Core provide a shared framework, student preparation and content knowledge needed for college, career, and civic life. The task and the extension of this webinar is the C3 ELSI investigation that's associated with exploring again this compelling question of why teachers should seek to integrate social studies instruction within literacy instruction. And there are various resources looking at instructional practice, videos, some articles, research-based articles, and some integrations and links to your experiences within classrooms as you begin to formulate as a team an argument to answer this compelling question. The investigation will be uploaded later this week, so you'll have access to that within a few days. And I thank you for your time this evening, and I hope that these resources are useful as they're archived and you take these to disseminate this information to build this national awareness that we have to have of the importance of the C3 framework and how it supports the disciplinary literacy skills necessary for achieving the expectations and the Common Core standards.
Don't hesitate in sharing your comments or questions via the chat box on your lower right-hand corner. With that, let me introduce today's presenter, Dr. Tina Hefner. Dr. Hefner is professor at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. She is the lead social studies methods instructor and directs the She is the lead Social Studies Methods instructor and directs the Master of Education in Secondary Education and the Minor in Secondary Education. She has published 7 books, including Targeted Vocabulary Instruction in Secondary Social Studies, Strategic Reading in World and U.S. History, and Seeds of Inquiry, using short texts to support students' understanding of U.S. history. Tina, thank you for being with us today and doing this presentation. Dr. Hefner, thank you for being with us today and doing this presentation.